Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I'm a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, we'll be speaking with Floyd Marinescu, the CEO and co-founder of C4 Media based in Canada. His firm provides software development news and learning events that reach some 1.5 million people each month. Senior software engineers participate in QCon conferences held in 7 of the world's major cities. Perhaps a few of the Smart Talk audience will want to know that Mr. Marinescu has been an investor in over a dozen startups. He is the author of a best-selling book, EJB Design Patterns, published in 2002. This was followed by a second book, Domain-Driven Design Quickly, in 2005. In the public policy arena, he is a strong proponent for the universal basic income. He describes himself as a community organizer at heart, working to build communities around interests and causes he cares about. Here is what he recently had to say on income and wealth inequality and the measures he embraces to change the distributional outcomes that now exist.
Hi, my name is Floyd Marinescu, and like many of you, I watched with concern as we see these videos of hundreds of police removing hundreds, even thousands of homeless people who had set up in tent cities around Canada. What are these people doing in tent cities in the parks? You could see them as exercising their traditional ancestral rights to live within something called the commons, common land. Land, traditionally among many human cultures, was held in common. People could hunt, fish, wherever they want, got together and farmed land together. Land was free and they could use it as they see fit. People owned the homes and the results of the profit of their work, but no one could really own land. And then we had, over many hundreds of years in Europe, many parts of the world, the nobility class, the landowners, took this land. This is called the enclosure movement, slowly took more and more of the land until there was nothing left for common people to live on. So that forced common people to have to get jobs and work for the man, work for the nobility. Not just workers, but capitalists alike, business owners, all had to pay rent or work for the nobility who owned the land and were profiting at the expense of workers and business owners alike. Because of this, the average person became much poorer than they were traditionally. They had to work harder and longer, paying the results of their work to the local noble who wasn't often paying taxes in whatever kingdom they were in. This is called a feudal land system. Today we live in a modern version of this where all land has been privatized. That is why the basic income advocates traditionally for the last tens and hundreds of years have seen basic income as a right, not as a social program, as a right, as compensation to all for loss of the commons, compensation for loss of something that we always had, which was the right to subsist, to exist on our own terms without having to work for someone else. And one of the means to offer that compensation traditionally was called a land value tax or a land use levy. People who use land, as Thomas Paine, one of the co-founders of America, proposed, if you're using land, you're taking from someone else, because where are they going to live once it's all privatized? This happened to our First Nations in Canada. If you use land, you should pay a tax for it. That money should go into a fund. I mean, it's not really a tax, it's a levy for use. If you're using something, then you pay to use it. That money would go into a fund and would pay everyone a UBI, so that people who are existing in a system where all land has been privatized can still exist. They can afford to go rent and live somewhere else. So we have lost the traditional commons. We have lost the rights to subsist. So basic income is seen as a rightful way to compensate for that loss. And naturally, since land is the source of this problem, land could also be part of the solution through a land use levy, a land value tax. So next time you see homeless people on the street, another point of view is they're just exercising their right to live and access the commons wherever they can find it.
Pretty remarkable set of insights from Floyd Marinescu, and we'll explore some of those thoughts in a few minutes. Back in August, Andrew Yang discussed with him how he came to embrace the universal basic income idea and his efforts to build public support among Canadians and thereby get elected representatives behind appropriate legislation. Smart Talk viewers are directed to this online conversation. rather than cover the same ground with him, I want to explore some of the technical issues associated with UBI, discuss with him the policy solutions both Thomas Paine and Henry George would be advocating were they alive today. He talked about Paine and Henry George in that short audio clip, and we'll talk about more of those as this program continues. Well, Floyd, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thank you for having me.
This is a great opportunity for us to have a conversation. In exploring your history and your work, first amazed at your entrepreneurial ability and what you've been able to put together. I thought I might ask you to take a few minutes at least to discuss a little bit about your background that they might not be able to find elsewhere online. What has motivated you to become the person you are?
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, well, when I was I went to university for computer science and somehow got into community development. I created a news website for software engineers that later was sold, and then created another one called InfoQ, which is around today, and still own that business, and a conference series called QCon. And my passion was always change and innovation, helping us innovate, helping us grow faster. Human progress through technology is the purpose of the company, C4 Media, that runs InfoQ and QCon. And it was a really wonderful experience, because what made that successful was creating communities of experts who would curate speakers and curate content training. I trained probably over 100 software engineers how to write journalistic style news, even though I was told it's impossible by journalists to do that. But engineers want to hear from each other. They want to hear from credible sources. So I've always been kind of a systems thinker and trying to build community to serve itself through our news and our events. And later on, got into angel investing and some VC stuff. And somehow, as my knowledge would grow, sort of an amateur economist, just came to become more aware and very concerned with how the world is going. Initially started in from a purely technology lens, understanding and learning about the impacts of technology on jobs, which is often not what people think. And the fourth industrial revolution, Andrew Yang was a huge inspiration. That's initially what got me into this whole basic income movement, seeing the urgency of it, but not just the urgency for what's to come, the urgency of what has already transpired. If you look at the slowing of wage growth, the impacts of automation, including on my own family, where my father and uncle were in the auto manufacturing sector, and then lost their careers in the early 2000s when China became a main competitor. Most people blame China, but in fact, the industry here responded with a tremendous amount of automation to stay competitive. And that automation is responsible for 4 times more job loss than trade. And that's been shown by many economists. So that's what really was the impetus for me to get into all this.
There's a good deal of a history involved in the movement to collect the revenue that's generated by increases in land values. I mean, Henry George was not the first. In fact, the idea of looking at the earth as a commons and the rent of land as a source of public revenue, as you may know, goes back even before Adam Smith. There are political economists who are looking at this issue and concluding that the value of the earth, of the land, belongs to everyone. And then the question is, well, how do we make that happen, and how do we do it in an equitable way? And so the universal basic income idea has arisen as one way to get there. And those of us who have studied the works of Henry George believe that the funding for the universal basic income should come from the rent of land and other sources of rent that economists would identify. I just wonder, have you done much reading on economics on this particular issue? And have you read any of Henry George's works?
Yeah, so this you're inviting me to explain a bit of a journey. Initially it was just
Right.
Basic income, technology, the funding source. I had no idea about rents. I had a strong intuition that there should be some way that humanity's collective progress should be represented in a way where we can all benefit beyond the story we're told that we only benefit through jobs and lower product goods, lower priced goods, which neither of which are 100% true. There must be some other means to express what is our progress, that if we owned it and benefit from it, we'd all be better off. And I never knew what it was. And I started my basic income advocacy from a purely this is urgent, by any means necessary lens. And as I spent a lot of time studying funding sources, studying the works of Professor Guy Standing, who is probably the foremost world expert on basic income, his co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network named Carl Widerquist, including all the way to Sam Altman, the president of Y Combinator, Silicon Valley startup incubator. And I noticed something strange in common all these three people had. They all advocated a land value tax as part of the funding mix. And I'm like, well, why? What's this about? It just was really new to me. So about a year and a half ago, I did read Progress and Poverty and started down this path, understanding the dynamics of land, the impacts it has on increasing poverty, on a number of the trends, the economic indicator trends like capital versus labor ratio and all these things that was concerning me, to provide a more holistic picture. And now I'm still in that learning journey. So I put it out there to the readers. If you're an economist who's interested in technology and land, particularly if you're in Canada and you want to help with research around rents, please reach out. We're trying to price and create funding proposals using rents, and we could use all the help we can get.
I suspect that there will be some viewers of Smart Talk who might be in contact with you. One person that I would hope eventually to put you together with was a leader of the Toronto Green Party named Frank de Young. Is his name at all familiar with you?
Yes. Yeah. So we worked with Frank and we produced a funding option a year ago, and but we're going deeper now on. And yes, I am in touch with Frank.
Great.
Carl Fitzgerald's from Australia and Gary Flamenhoft. But need more Canadian researchers who can crunch the numbers.
Well, you've reached out, you're in touch with the right people, the people that I would strongly recommend that anyone interested in public collection of rents talk to in Canada. Yeah. And
so yeah, just to finish that thought, I guess where I've come to now is that this concept of our technological inheritance, as I spoke of in a TEDx talk a while ago, and now I understand that humanity's technological inheritance is economic rents. And I'm trying to find ways to express that, create narrative around it, make it easy to understand. And of course, the most important of all that would be land rents. Now, for viewers from the basic income background, it doesn't mean that we're not about basic income by all means, any means, urgently. We are. I can see a need for a blended model where you have what's called a basic income guarantee built on top of dividends from rents and land and such that are the collective ownership of all.
Well, one of the challenges that reformers have is that we have an existing system. And the question is, do you move toward a better system incrementally, or do you try to scrap the existing structure and replace it? And those of us who advocate Henry George's approach believe that this can be done peacefully and incrementally over time with minimal disruption to the economy, and in fact, done in a way that will cause the economy to experience sustained growth without harming the environment and addressing many of the distribution problems that exist today. And politically, it's just been very difficult for proponents to find a constituency to make it happen in the political arena. So, from what I listened to you talk about, that's one of your priorities, is to generate public support and interest so that there's enough public pressure to get the politicians interested enough to advance legislation. Is that a fair assessment?
That's right. So the nonprofit I started a couple of years ago, it's called UBIWorks. It focuses in Canada. And we're starting from a bottom-up, people-powered, media-centric view. So our goal is to build a groundswell of people support to make it impossible to not run in an election and win. So right now we're the largest social media channels. We have 60,000 email lists and we talk about basic income from an anti-poverty lens. And so I have spoken to MPs. We have funded research that shows that basic income would grow the economy, and a number of things, how we can pay for it, various ways. But the discussion in Canada is primarily taking place from an anti-poverty lens. And as I learn more about land and its impact, I've come to feel that that's actually a different conversation. That if land reform would be merited perhaps on its own merits, and it's not necessarily related to an anti-poverty discussion. I've been thinking actually that it might have more success in the coming decade because of rising housing prices, so which affects the middle class. And that's something I'd love to see more. Maybe viewers can send me articles. Where have there been articles that link collecting land rents to falling or housing prices? Because I haven't seen anything yet, other than the great narratives.
Well, there's a good deal of writing on the subject, and it's one of the challenges that this idea of moving to land value taxation has, because the middle class in the United States, and I'm guessing the same is true of the Canadians, that much of the net worth that people have is the equity in their residential property. And because housing units are depreciating assets over time, the value, the net worth they have in their house falls, but it increases in the land because of the way the land market operates. So you're asking people who've had a very difficult time saving enough for retirement to potentially give up the equity in the rising land prices that they've experienced. And somehow that has to be reconciled politically, and people have to be taken care of. My feeling on this is it has to be done over time. So most proponents of moving to a land-based property tax will advocate that it be done over, say, a 10-year period. And that would give markets time to adjust, even though, the theoretical observation is that the higher the rent collected by the public, the lower land prices will become. So theoretically, land prices could fall to zero. I'm sure Frank DeYoung and Carl Fitzgerald have talked about that as a long-term potential outcome that we have to deal with. So there have been all sorts of proposals for circuit breakers. Say a certain amount of land equity would be exempt from land rent taxation, all ways so that we don't destroy the middle class while we're trying to make the system more equitable for their children, for example. This may be something that you're familiar with, but in many neighborhoods in the middle class cities of the United States, the adult children of homeowners can't live anywhere close by because property costs are too high. So we get urban sprawl as a result of it, and people are forced to commute longer and longer distances. So I think
this is where, but this is where Thomas Paine's ideas could save the day, and where the pure Georgist view maybe hasn't worked, which is if people are receiving dividends, then you can make a compelling case that you're trading land equity for cash equity. And the value of, say, $500 a month, or let's say it's in Canada, by our calculations, a full land rent, 5.5%, would generate $1,000 a month for all adults. $1,000 a month, if you're 18, is like being given $1.3 million of equity into today's interest rates. I just made that up, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. And if you're 60, maybe it's as if you got 300,000 or 400,000 in equity. That's not a bad trade if you consider the cash value of that annuity of $1,000 a month, like forever. So I think there are arguments there that could be made that link this type of land reform to middle class empowerment in a pure cash manner that is hard to ignore.
I agree with you. There is one concern that I have voiced on that specific approach, and that is, when in economics you increase the demand side of a market without increasing the supply side, you run into price increases. And so it's very likely that giving every household $1,000 a month will particularly adversely affect renters, that landlords will be in a position to raise their rents for apartments. And it also could translate into higher property prices generally. So my view is that in proposing the UBI, we need to also stress with communities that they have to address the supply of affordable housing, and that much more revenue needs to be allocated to construct affordable housing than is being allocated today by communities. And and by higher levels of government. And that would address, I think, my main concern about just giving people, X amount of dollars a month as an additional income, that the market for land could take away a good deal of that benefit, for at least for many people.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this again, and this is theoretical, but let's separate which basic incomes we're discussing here. If we're discussing an anti-poverty basic income guarantee, which is a much smaller sticker price, it's really the minimum amount to create a negative income tax, a floor above which the benefit amount reduces as earned income increases. That will not have such a dramatic impact on rents. It's really people in the bottom 10 to 20% who would have a little bit more money for rent, who could afford to perhaps move up to slightly better accommodations. It's not going to affect people in the fourth, fifth middle class income deciles. They won't have a lot of the benefit. So I don't see, I mean, most of these people we already live somewhere now. But in that case, of course, we always need more affordable housing. However, in the case of land rents, paying out a land UBI specifically, this is where something is, it seems to me that people who are renting, they're already paying land rent. Now it's just that their landlords are also going to pay land rent. And it seems that it would be a cycle that would defeat itself if the landlords increase the rent, but then also have to pay higher land rent themselves because they've now increased the value of their land by charging more rent. So at some point, that's why economists say that land rent collection does not increase, does not change how demand and supply for land.
You're absolutely correct, and I don't want to mislead you in what I said. If we do begin to collect much more land rent, then what you're saying, it will be absolutely true. The problem is, how do you get both policies implemented at the same time? We have property taxes right now that in the most distressed communities tend to be regressive, because the assessed value of properties in those neighborhoods tends not to fall with the decline in their actual market value, as opposed to in well-to-do neighborhoods and communities, assessments tend to trail increases in property value. So there's assessment issues that have to be dealt with, and if we can get land value taxation adopted at the same time as the UBI is put into play, you're absolutely right. My fear is that it will take a lot more. It's already taken a long time to get even a nominal number of communities, even in Australia, where it's been the most successful, to adopt a very rigorous land value tax, structure. And so we have a lot of work to do on that side of the battle. Whereas it seems the universal basic income is becoming a much more popular and even politically popular policy to adopt. So that's my concern, that we don't get enough rent collected to offset the demand side of the equation, and so landowners could in fact pocket most of the increase in disposable income.
Yeah, well, we haven't seen that in any of the pilots, although they haven't been that long running in terms of landlords and renters. But yeah, now UBI is getting more popular, but it's getting more popular from an anti-poverty perspective, not from a property market optimization or reducing the cost of land perspective. So that discussion is still very hidden, despite the efforts of Professor Guy Standing and Carl Widerquist, who are leaders in the movement. I'm not sure people even hear them when Guy Standing says that UBI should be compensation for loss of the commons, because policymakers are just thinking about what's the cheapest way to reduce poverty, and that's their job. So I have this feeling that the land rents that could pay land dividends is a conversation of its own that may have its own justifications in terms of lowering the cost of housing, owning land together, which has other interesting conversations around improving our relationship to land, our relationship to our indigenous brothers and sisters, being able to share in land value increasing. Yeah, I'm still sorting that all out right now, trying to figure that out. But the conversations seem similar, but they haven't quite gone hand in hand, despite a lot of smart people's good efforts.
these good efforts have been taking place ever since Thomas Paine wrote Agrarian Justice in 1795. And and a long list of very thoughtful people followed Paine along that path, and up to including Henry George and many thereafter. The economist that has written so much on this all these issues that I'm most familiar with was Mason Gaffney. I don't know if his name is all familiar to you.
Just read a bit of his stuff, but I haven't started yet fully deep on his work.
But there have been many economists who have, picking up these arguments and written about them extensively, and it's just been so difficult to get the measures that even the common sense that comes out of these debates into the political arena. And in the United States, certainly one of the challenges is, and this is true in most countries, is that the collection of land rent is a local issue. And so you have, and I don't know what the type of municipal organization is in Canada, but in any community here in the United States, you probably have 3 or 4 different taxing bodies collecting property tax revenue. There's the municipality itself, a township, a borough, and then the major one in the United States continues to be the school district. So for advocates of land value taxation here, it's convincing convincing those different jurisdictions to change the system that they have in place and have had in place, now for 100 or more years. And we also have the challenge here of state constitutional problems. Do the provinces, to your knowledge in Canada, does the constitution of each province permit moving to land value taxation, or is there that obstacle to overcome as well?
My understanding, and this is based on only a few conversations, that the provinces can do that, but Canada also has an equalization system to equalize between provinces a standard of living. So it's something I need to investigate further, but I'm understanding that it's possible that the provinces could collect land rents that would then impact the whole country.
Right now, are they using income tax revenue in order for that equalization process?
Income tax, some resource rents where there are that, and it's the cities. I think there's only 3 levels of taxation here. It's the cities that collect property tax for local use.
Yeah. As Frank DeYoung may have told you in your conversations with him, there were a few Canadian municipalities that had a single tax.
Really?
Back in history. Yeah. One was Milk River in Alberta. I think it was Alberta. And there were a few others, but there's a good deal of history that goes back to Henry George's time of advocacy for a single tax altogether, meaning the elimination of all taxes except that on land values or on the rent of land.
Well, I was, just to slightly change subject slightly, I was listening to Fred Harrison talk about how the narrative needs to change, and there's been failure in discussing it from an efficiency perspective. And I get back to he says we need another narrative. And I hear this from a lot of economists, even in the basic income movement, saying we need another narrative. And on the land side, there's something poetic and beautiful when Henry George says we should hold land as common property. Or another way of saying it is that if we own land together, then we'd all collect the rent and receive rental income from it together. And there'd be no advantage for anyone to hold more land than they need, or to take more than is necessary, because we all benefit from it anyway. And if we did that, then we would reduce a lot of the perverse incentives that exist in the market today that are holding back productive developments, that are keeping land from being forested or from being farmed. And it would be a net benefit for everyone. I've been wondering if these types of more heart-driven narratives, there might be a moment in time now where this starts to make sense by connecting common ownership of land through collecting of land rents to stabilizing the housing market, to indigenous reparations, to all these things that we're increasing our awareness of these days.
Well, Fred Harrison is in the process of completing, I guess, the second volume of his trilogy titled #We Are Rent. And we've talked to Fred on Smart Talk not too long ago. And he was recently interviewed in Australia for Prosper Australia. And his message is powerful, and he's sending out a warning to us: if we don't act soon, it may be too late. And it's a scary prognosis of the future if we don't begin to treat the planet as our commons and treat the planet with the kind of respect that it needs to have from us. But here again, when you're asking people to think very differently about their relationship to the earth and to land than they have considered that relationship for hundreds of years. I'm hopeful, but it's hard to be optimistic. I'm hopeful when I meet someone like you, who in recent years has come to these perspectives and realized how important they are. As I said, someone has been in the classroom teaching Henry George's ideas for 40 years. And my own background was in finance. I spent the last 20 years of my career as a business manager and a market analyst at Fannie Mae. And I did my best to convince the housing experts in this country, in the United States, of the value of the ideas that were coming out of Henry George's work. And what I found was that while they had a sense that this was right, they were so committed to the ideas that they had learned in their training, in their own education, in the planning community, et cetera. It was very difficult to dislodge those priorities. And so the planning community is very much devoted to planning, and we can't discard planning, but the idea of land value taxation seems to be always just marginalized outside of the scheme of the planning community. And the influence of the planning community on the political community, to me is still pretty strong. We try to reach them through the courses that we teach at the school, other online programs. The work that you're doing is tremendous. And I guess one of the things that I want to say is, how can I help?
Well, as I mentioned, I spent 2 years promoting basic income without talking at all about where the money should come from. And even now in Canada, we're working on a proposal for basic income that would not involve the collection of land rents, but would indirectly involve collection of more of the capital gain on investment properties and other forms of passive wealth accumulation. Basically, you want to show that you can pay for an anti-poverty basic income guarantee without costing the middle class all the way up to people who make $150,000, and without creating investment disincentives. But still, in that conversation, land isn't really present. So I'm planning to create another brand, another conversation. I call it Commonwealth, where we can have conversations around rents in land and the benefit of those sources of co-ownership and rent collection, and then pre-distribution to a population, whether it's through UBI or lowered income taxes. So yeah, how you can help, if you could be a mentor and I can ask you questions, or anyone who's listening to this wants to suggest that, because I think I've seen mistakes on both sides. Again, on the basic income side, the people who've been doing this for 40 years, they kind of weave in land somehow, but it's always a weak argument because it's always being led through poverty and basic income. But then on the Georgia side, it's always about efficiency and better planning. But from neither side, what I'm not hearing is, what is the inherent benefit of simply us seeing ourselves as holding land and as common wealth for the purpose of rent collection, so we all benefit, and how that will leave middle class people better off in its own right. And the urgency that drives me in this direction, because it was kind of painful, because I feel like this conversation could be distracting from the basic income movement, which is why I feel the need that it to have a different brand, to happen separately. My urgency is a bit different from Fred Harrison's. Yes, I think we are facing ecological disaster, but from a technology perspective, I see wages are not growing. People are increasing. Job displacement will be happening very soon. It's already been happening. And if all that's happening at the same time, so technology is, I call it the big squeeze. With technology is holding wages flat from growth because we're creating excess labor while creating so much job disruption. Meanwhile, from the bottom is land rents increasing, and that's like a clamp that's squeezing people's well-being and squeezing people's discretionary incomes to the point of no return. And that's what's, I think, is causing a lot of the populist movements we have. So it's land and technology, but at the end of the day, it comes back to what is this common wealth that technology is increasing its value on that we could be sharing? And all roads seem to point to land and economic rents. And so I think the urgency is more people's jobs being displaced, whether they know it or not, because it's not just people who are being fired, rather people who are not being hired as companies become far more efficient, much faster than the job market can replace. And it's not replacing jobs with middle-class jobs, it's replacing them with increasingly lower paid jobs. So what happens when land prices keep going up while wages for 60% of the population are going down or stagnant? And people just have to keep moving further and further away from where they want to live. It's an unbearable situation. So I think rents has to be part of the solution somehow, and creating public awareness of even this concept of that rents exist and we should co-own them somehow is the challenge, I think. Because I guess my own, if I were to tell myself 2 years ago what I knew now, or other basic income advocates, is how will anti-poverty income support programs outrun rising land prices? At some point they can. We may have a victory now, but in 20 years, will those payments amount to enough? The same way our existing social support programs, the payments did not amount to enough after 20 years of not growing fast enough, even with inflated and made up inflation numbers, even if it is indexed to inflation. So that's a big concern I have, is that a holistic solution needs to involve land, because if land is the problem, land has to be part of the solution too.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, there are those who are looking forward to the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next as an offset to the outcomes that you've just described. I mean, the upper middle class and even the middle class in the United States still have a tremendous reservoir of assets to transfer to the next generation. What that will do in terms of forestalling the inevitable, I really don't know. But hopefully some economists are looking at that issue very closely to see, what effect it will have. You also talked a little bit about capital gains, and while we're working for reforms, one of the reforms that some of us think is absolutely necessary is the elimination of the distinction between income that's derived from the sale of any asset versus income from wages. That is actually really counterproductive from an equity standpoint to give so-called capital gains beneficial treatment under the tax code. As an entrepreneur and a business owner, how would you react to elimination of the distinction?
I think in Canada, it's already the case. There's taxes off income, then there's a reduced tax regime. There's an inclusion rate for taxes on the sale of capital. So the capital is taxed at 50% less. 50% of it is included as regular income tax. So effectively, if I sell my company or I sell a stock portfolio or a second or third property, then that's only taxed in the net around 25% at the top marginal rate, versus income, which can be as high as 50, 55 in some cases. So in Canada, maybe it's a bit further along, but in Canada, land is still classified as capital. And it would be great progress if that was declassified from capital. So, again, with this funding plan we're putting together for an anti-poverty basic income, we're doing it within the current imagination of the taxation systems. We're not talking about land, but one of the ideas is to is to remove this exclusion of capital gains tax and effectively tax capital gains at the same rate as income for all assets except corporate shares. Because corporate shares, if we want to argue, we don't want to mess with investment incentives, private capital investment, real entrepreneurship, then corporate shares would be excluded, and so that means the majority of that tax would actually fall on second and third non-principal residence homes in terms of increasing that to a maximum of from 25 to 50% on sale. So again, not trying to change the understanding of what capital versus land, but just use the existing language and say, well, let's remove this capital gains exemption, which mostly helps the wealthy, except for corporate shares, so we don't mess around with the entrepreneurs. Again, just trying to be incrementalist, because the purpose of that proposal is to show that we can pay for a basic income without harming working class or middle class people.
There's a general feeling among citizens of the United States that Canada is far more progressive in so many ways than we are, and that your political situation leans more to the progressive and left side. Do you see that as in evidence by the response that you get and the support you get from members of parliament and local government?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't spoken to American Congress people by comparison, but in Canada, there is a growing, it is certainly a more progressive country. Conservative governments wouldn't think of slashing, social support programs or getting into Republican style tactics. And there is a growing body of members of parliament who are for basic income across many different parties. It's just that their parties are not officially for it yet. But hopefully that will change. I think it's inevitable that will change. But yeah, in general, I think Mason Gaffney, isn't he from British Columbia? I think so.
No, he wasn't. I'm pretty sure he was not Canadian by birth.
Okay. Yeah.
But one of our colleagues, Ted Gortney, did in fact work in British Columbia for many years as a assessor, and helped to set up the property assessment system in the province of British Columbia. And he's someone who has advocated for his entire career for the movement to a land value tax structure, and continue to do so. Yeah,
in Canada, there's the three largest parties. There's center left, and then center right. It's basically the parties that tend to hold sway. So an interesting thing happened this last election is that both the center and the center right parties were borrowing the left-leaning parties' ideas to try and pull voters away. So there seems to be definitely a progressive push, and hopefully that leads to a basic income faster. I'm not sure it'll lead to land reform faster, because as you know, that's the hidden cat that no one can see, which hopefully through my campaigning work and other work of people like yourself, we can make that more visible.
So I get the sense from that comment that the population in Canada is generally far more progressive in their social policy attitudes than perhaps exists in the United States, that we're far more divided here ideologically over the role of government. Even within within the community of people who embrace Henry George's basic idea of collecting land rent, there are some who very much believe in the absolute free market, that the role for government is minimal, and that we should move as much toward a libertarian view of the role of government. And then there are others who very strongly embrace Henry George's ideas, that believe that government has a major role, not just as an umpire to set a level playing field, but to take on the challenges of solving some of the social problems and economic problems that exist. And my own sense of what we're fighting for ideologically or philosophically, is to find the right balance between property rights and human rights. And it's a struggle for the heart and the soul of people in this country right now, and it's been growing. I don't know which direction it's going to go, and certainly we've experienced this kind of debate in a political arena. What is, in your contact with your counterparts in the United States, do you get a sense of which way this struggle is going? That business people in technology are beginning to recognize that there needs to be a different role for the public sector, and what kind of responses are you getting from that segment of the population, the people you interact with in the business community?
Well, I spoke to quite a lot of founders, entrepreneur types, mid-sized business owners about basic income, and the support was fairly positive. Maybe 1 in 3 in the US would have a libertarian view that is not compatible with that idea, although a lot of libertarians are also for it, for obvious reasons too. One of my heroes in this movement, his name is Nick Hanauer. He, in this progressive economics movement, he created a think tank called Civic Action out of Seattle, and they're responsible for raising the minimum wage and overall promoting progressive economics and economics as a force for good. He was a huge inspiration for me getting started in what I'm doing. He's a billionaire venture capitalist who's trying to change narratives, change minds. I think for the most part, he's been successful. He's probably the hidden cause of the Fight for 15 movement. So there are a lot of people like that who are seeing that trickle-down economics hasn't worked. And we're seeing more mainstream economists proving that it's not working. And I'm hoping that in America and the UK and the world, we start to kind of swing the pendulum a little bit back to the center in terms of what the role of government should be, and in understanding the correct, the place between the market and government, and what are the right interactions. And I think, Nick Hanauer has a book called The Gardens of Democracy, where he kind of unpacks and dismantles a lot of common talking points and myths. And I think he makes the case that the role of government is not to play the game, but to set the rules of the game, so that the rules benefit people more inclusively, benefit the planet. And certainly, we have seen that work, where it's been tried. And I think, frankly, the world's going to have as we watch China continue to, bowl past us economically. And in many ways, China is doing a better job economically in terms of its conception of economic rents and its ability to create markets and create private sector players in those markets. Obviously, they probably overshoot in many ways that we wouldn't, but there are lessons to be learned there.
Yes, the Chinese basically have said that the centuries of dominance by the West was an interlude in the period of influence of Chinese thinking, and that they've taken control again. And they seem to have, they figured out how to achieve a high level of productivity, and they've really increased the state of well-being of their people. But their system is not perfect either. They still have, problems where they have cities that they've built that were empty because of the failure to deal with the speculative aspect of the property markets. And I haven't seen anything lately of what they're doing about all those empty buildings that are scattered around China. But if they ever get it right, if they ever get the land question solved, and I know that they've been listening to people who bringing the idea that public collection of rent is one of the paths to go, that if they ever get that right, and if they ever establish a universal basic income for their people, then the West will have a lot to worry about in terms of the dominance of the Chinese. So, have you been to China? Have you had any exposure to their top thinking people?
I've been to China many times because when I started my business, within a year, I started a Chinese version of it, a Chinese language version of our news website for software engineers, and Chinese events, QCon in Beijing, Shanghai, and created a team there. Wonderful team. It was a wonderful thing to work with people who were a product of the Chinese economic miracle, people whose parents were farmers, and they now were in the city doing tech jobs within one generation. The president of the organization in China, who I later sold our assets to him, so he's running it independently. Like, he came from a town that had didn't have pavement, didn't have paved streets. 3,000 people. China was evolving its education system so fast that he got a computer science degree in a school that didn't afford to have actual computers in it until he was in his third year. So he was learning how to program on paper and being graded on paper. Like, that's how fast the economy was moving to train people for the jobs of the future. So I had a chance to see this, to work with these wonderful people, many of which had a rural background, now in this tech company, and they grew way bigger than my business, and we're still good friends. So it was a good opportunity to go there and see some of that development happening over the last 15 years. Although I had no connections whatsoever to government or anyone at any high up, just more the people in the software engineering community who were sort of leading their own charge there and creating their own infrastructures.
Did you feel comfortable with China's legal structure, its ability to support, enforce contract law, that kind of thing? Was that ever an issue for you in China?
Yeah, well, I will admit, every time I went to China, I was always careful about what computers I brought and what privacy measures I took, because you can get your stuff scanned at any point in time. So I remember a story of a speaker from Amazon came to one of our conferences and had an old laptop. And we asked him, why do you have that old laptop? Don't you get better laptops from Amazon? Because we flew to Beijing together to speak. He's like, when I go home, I have to throw this in a shredder. That's how Amazon treats its data security, sending engineers to China. So I was like, wow, that's a real concern. Yeah, actually, I didn't have to deal with any of that because the fellow I worked with to start the business there effectively had a local private company as a proxy. And we had a kind of a contractual arrangement that avoided me having to have any actual footprint in China besides trademarks and training and contractual arrangements for the movements of revenues and profits. So I avoided all of that. Still we ran a successful multi-million-dollar business, and I'm quite fulfilled thinking about that. I was able to create a business with brands and even employee culture that spanned many regions. We had our events in Brazil, China, France, Japan. We had a franchisee there. The UK, and so China was one of them, and it was amazing to see its tech community grow from a very small to what it is today, which rivals Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it's the rate of growth has been pretty astounding.
And on the land issue, I'm kind of struck with the statement I heard Joseph Stiglitz make. He said that the majority of China's economic growth for its first 30 years of development, moving out of an agricultural economy, was due to privatization of farmer profits while maintaining public ownership of land. And he said that proves that you can have something like Henry George's ideas with keeping 95% of the economic benefits and the economic incentives in place. And that stat and that observation really struck with me, because even today there is speculation in China's land market, but China has 100% land value capture and property capture, which is maybe where the communism part comes in, because after the lease expires, they keep everything. So that's certainly not what Henry George was proposing, but that is how China is financing extraordinary amounts of public infrastructure. And I read a paper that the abnormal amount of infrastructure investment is happening because of land value capture, primarily on the state level. So that's why they have high-speed trains. That's why they have corporate and income taxes that are lower than the US. So how come they have all this investment with lower taxes? It's because they have land value capture.
Yeah, perhaps the Chinese government has learned a little bit from the experience of Hong Kong, where the land remained in the hands of the British colonial authorities for so long. And there's a lot of discussion about the extent to which the collection of land rents under the British led to Hong Kong's dramatic expansion. There was also a German colony in China in the 1900s that was administered to collect land rent, and the history there is that of all of the colonies that were run by European powers, the German colony did the best because of the fact that it collected land rent to pay for the colony's infrastructure. So there are many lessons to be learned, and I'd hope that the Chinese eventually do get it right, and that they also begin to think more about human rights as well as dealing with the economic growth that they've dealt with. So, Floyd, I thank you so much for your time and for joining us on this episode of Smart Talk. If there's a last message you'd like to leave for our viewers, I'd give you that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, these viewers are very familiar with land. So especially if you're in Canada, if you want to help out with this work, send me an email, Floyd@UBIWorks. Yeah, something I'm still also very concerned with, I mentioned, is technology. And I think if there's one takeaway we get from all the talk around technology displacing jobs, is that it's lowering wages. It's lowering wages because it's changing faster than we can handle. And with rising land prices, that just makes it a double whammy. And so, yeah, I think Andrew Yang's campaign for president created, I love his narrative that we are shareholders in the economy. Shareholders of what? And that's where I think the economic rents arguments comes in. So I'm interested in narratives that explain in simple words why economic rents should be seen as collective ownership or co-ownership. I don't have a good one yet. So if you know one, maybe you can tell me, Ed, and others can help. But yeah, thank you all for the work you're doing as well. And
well, we'll definitely follow up with you again in the future for sort of a progress report, and I will certainly keep paying attention to what you're doing, and I'll try to provide you any papers that seem to add to the evidence that you're looking for.
Thank you.
But with that, let me just say that I thank you so much for being with us and for joining us with this episode of Smart Talk. And I'll say that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. Again, I'm Edward Dodson, and thanks everyone for watching Smart Talk.